Right now, the Chinese Communist Party and the United States are fighting a hidden spy war against one another, and on the front lines of this battle for China is their shadowy Ministry of State Security, also known as the MSS. We'll see how this agency has a long history of brutal political purges and interrogation tactics. It's one of the world's largest and most secretive agencies of all. For context, they're said to have an estimated 110,000 agents, compared to the CIA's roughly 21,000. It's like their version of the FBI and the CIA all rolled up into one. They have both a domestic and a foreign mission under one roof. At least, that's how this partially redacted document from the US Justice Department describes it. But not many people in the West even know about their history that informs many of their tactics that they use today. Not many people know about some of the most brazen intelligence missions that they've pulled off, where they've targeted and killed dozens of CIA agents in their country, including in brutal public executions. The way it works is the MSS has control of its own separate police force called the State Security Police, which is a component of the People's Armed Police. I actually recently got into an argument with a member of China's People's Armed Police on Twitter with their quasi-unofficial account that has over 100,000 followers. I directly messaged him and asked if I could come and visit and observe their military training in China. He said that they're aware of who I am and that geopolitical tensions between our countries meant that it was impossible. So it's good to know that the MSS is watching my work, even if it might just be hate watching. He did mention some interesting things though. He said that the MSS is responsible for both internal and external roles, that they're now granted with limited law enforcement rights in China. I tried to turn him into an asset for the West at that point, but he said that I wouldn't be able to get any secrets out of him. Fair enough. But how can you tell an MSS agent apart from their People's Armed Police? Take a look at this seal. You can see the emblem of the Chinese Communist Party and their official uniform. It's identical to the People's Police except one small difference that lets you tell them apart. It says State Security on the patch. The MSS in China has a clear mission. They manage local political dissidents and they counter foreign intelligence operations that are made by like the CIA. And if you stick around till the end, I'll get into some of their most modern missions that they pull off recently. I try to stay as objective as possible on geopolitical topics, but the oversimplification of complex situations in today's news, especially on social media, can make that really hard. And that's why I swear by Ground News. Ground News is a website, browser plugin, and an app created to make reading the news more transparent. It compiles news from thousands of local and international outlets so you can see the bias, factual reliability, and ownership of every source. Take this story we covered recently about a potential new Chinese radar site in Cuba. On Ground News, I have access to over 50 articles that covered the story, and this makes it easy to flip between headlines to see how different biases shape the narrative. If you only read news from a handful of outlets, you could completely miss this story. And that's why their blind spot feature is dedicated to showing stories with skewed coverage like this. So if you're serious about staying informed like I am, go to ground.news/task. They're offering their best discount of the year, exclusive to Task viewers, for 50% off their best plan, Vantage, which unlocks all these features. The roots of the Ministry of State Security can be traced all the way back to an organization known as the Central Special Branch, established in 1928. It was initially founded by a man named Zhou Enlai, who would later go on to serve as the first premier of the People's Republic of China. During the early 1930s, the Central Special Branch carried out covert operations in Shanghai, which was a hotbed of international political intrigue. Many of China's intelligence officers today see this as kind of the origin of their group, kind of like how CIA agents might look back and see the OSS of World War II as their initial roots. Zhou Enlai's main goal for the agency was to infiltrate their rivals at the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang was the dominant political power in China at the time that sought to suppress the communist movement. This is where China early intelligence agencies cut their teeth. In the book Chinese Spies, From Chairman Mao to Xi Jinping, they state that in order to prevent leaks and limit damage caused by infiltration by nationalist spies, agents of Techie were forbidden to have any relationship with other agents, making the party so compartmentalized that many that worked there never even knew the name of the organization, only calling it by its nickname, Wu Hou Dagger, which was a reference to Zhou Enlai's nom de guerre, or war name. But a trend would emerge. It would start here and it would repeat many times, as we'll see, because the Central Special Branch was rebranded into the Central Social Affairs Department, or SAD, in 1936. This is something you see a lot in intelligence agencies, actually. American intel agencies also like to rebrand their name every couple of decades to hide from what they've done in the past. In 1936, it was a major milestone of a year in Chinese intelligence history. The SAD played a critical role in orchestrating negotiations between the Kuomintang nationalist leaders and the Communist Party. Operatives arrested the Kuomintang's rival leader and forced them to negotiate. Out of this negotiation, they formed a temporary alliance against the Japanese invasion instead of fighting one another. Historians widely believe this helped prevent the CCP from being destroyed outright and allowed them to consolidate their strength. In the 1940s, during World War II, it was a wild time for China's intelligence agencies. Kang Sheng, director of the organization at the time, developed this deep sense of paranoia regarding potential spies within his own team. This might be the darkest time period of Chinese intelligence that I've ever heard of, but I think it helps us get into the headspace of how they think, and it explains a little bit about what we see them do later. Kang said, quote, "There is a close link between the twin crimes of espionage and political deviationism. One is not a political deviationist, as we have tended to believe by chance or by error. We must begin a ruthless hunt to root out those two plagues, because by fighting against deviationism, we weaken the clandestine plots of our enemies and vice versa." Political deviationism means like if you stray a little bit from the politically correct narrative inside China at the time. He was basically convinced that about 30% of his entire intelligence agency were double agents. So he created quotas. In these quotas, they would use extreme techniques of punishment that were inspired by a millennia of traditions of some of the worst methods of physical punishment in China. I'm using euphemisms here, but I'm talking about what we would like to call in the West enhanced interrogation. Kang was also deeply influenced by Stalinist purges in the Soviet Union, and so he brought this purging mentality and the brutal tactics that come with it into CCP intelligence work. Kang is considered one of the most influential spies in China's entire history. Many officers were purged, often without much of any kind of substantial evidence. These purges were notorious for their brutality, as many CCP officials were imprisoned, tortured, or even executed under what I would call dubious charges. I can't say exactly what was done, but I can say some words as hints. Bamboo spikes, high water pressure, and really I can't even scratch the surface other than to say look it up. I'll put some links in the description. It's horrific. The way Kang's hold on the Chinese intelligence agencies ended was actually kind of ironic. The leader of China, Mao Zedong, forced Kang to write a self-criticism where he admitted that he was wrong and that only 10% of his organization were spies that he had originally accused. He was relieved of duty in 1944. And as with anything in the intelligence world, there are rumors and theories as to why this happened. It could have been because his physician later claimed that the man was a schizophrenic and that's why he was so paranoid all the time. U.S. intelligence claimed that it might have been because of the collapse and death of Stalin, so China wanted to cut ties with some of their officers that were trained in Moscow. We may never know exactly what happened. I can already hear the comments that the CIA is way worse, but there's already tons of videos on that on YouTube, and that's not what this video is about. This period was marked by a culture of fear and suspicion within the party. In an attempt to distance the intelligence service from Kang Sheng's purge-centric approach, the organization was rebranded as the CCP's Central Investigation Department, or CID, by 1949. This gave them a fresh start, a new coat of paint, and they tried to become more of a professionalized intel agency, as the CCP prepared to take full power in China. In the 1950s, almost every Chinese embassy worldwide housed an investigation and research office, which served as a kind of cover for intelligence officers affiliated with the Central Investigation Department. These officers closely monitored diplomats and embassy personnel. Hey, what's that you're reading there? Is that on the approved list? These spies attended meetings and relayed information back to the CID headquarters. Espionage inside Hong Kong was perfect of a training ground for China's spies to learn advanced new tradecraft. Remember, Hong Kong was still a British colony at the time, so operatives were in this kind of spy v spy war with American, British intelligence, and the Soviets were there. A Chinese man by the name of Li Kenyang was instrumental in these operations in Hong Kong. He's known inside China as one of the most influential spies in their history, the Chinese version of James Bond. Li was responsible for working closely with Soviet intelligence advisors to gather information on US forces during the Korean War. The Cultural Revolution in China during the 1960s threw their intelligence agencies for another loop. Intelligence officials who were loyal to the rivals of Mao were absolutely purged. The Communist Party consolidated control and eliminated opposition, even amongst themselves. Once the intelligence agencies were purged of Mao's perceived enemies, they were used to support the repression that occurred throughout the country. The security apparatus worked alongside the Red Guards, providing logistical support and often carrying out arrests and interrogations of individuals who were accused of being enemies of the people. Hundreds of thousands to millions of people were purged during this time. It wasn't just domestic missions, though. China's CID intelligence agency played a significant role in the Cambodian massacres of the 1970s. In November 1978, the CID assisted in establishing the infamous S-21 interrogation and extermination camp. S-21 is where approximately 20,000 Cambodians fell victim to Pol Pot's genocidal regime. Intelligence agencies everywhere are terrifying. However, the Chinese intelligence apparatus suffered a significant setback in Cambodia when the Socialist Republic of Vietnam launched a surprise invasion of Kampuchea. This invasion caught the CID and Chinese leadership off guard, as they failed to anticipate Vietnamese military action. Despite the presence of thousands of Chinese military and advisors inside Cambodia at the time, only a single solitary agent with a malfunctioning radio managed to escape the country, and he left behind 4,000 of his civilian advisors to the invading Vietnamese forces. As the Cultural Revolution drew to a close in the late 1970s, the CCP sought to stabilize itself after a tumultuous decade. Deng Xiaoping emerged as the leader of the country. Having lived through the atrocities of Mao's Cultural Revolution, the repressive tactics of secret police, he was determined to overhaul the Chinese intelligence apparatus. Deng restructured the Central Investigation Department. He made it less about repressing his own people and more about facing the challenges of China's increasing global position on the world stage. In June 1983, the CID merged with the counterintelligence elements of the Ministry of Public Security to form the Ministry of State Security, and that is its current form today. In its current form, the MSS has been tasked with safeguarding the entire state's security. I say the MSS has both domestic and international missions, but that's not exactly accurate. The Ministry of Public Security also exists, but they're primarily a law enforcement agency. They house the Department of Political Security Protection, so these are the guys who are responsible for internal political surveillance. Their scope is limited to domestic affairs, though, and doesn't extend to that foreign intel mission like the MSS. The headquarters of the Ministry of State Security is located in Beijing. It's made up of 18 different bureaus. Never enough bureaucracy and middle management in the CCP. They even have one bureau that's specifically dedicated to focusing on operations against the United States. I'd be kind of insulted if they didn't. Thought we're their number one rival. Truth be told, the CIA also has their own unit responsible for China's operations. But to the point of bureaucracy, the way it's spread is interesting. Shortly after its establishment, local governments began setting up provincial MSS departments. By the late 1980s, some jurisdictions had already established local state security organizations. This extended the reach of the MSS. At the operational level, local state security bureaus possess a certain degree of autonomy. They can independently decide on what type of missions they want to do. The range of intelligence operations conducted by local MSS agencies is extensive. They collect contacts on foreign consulate officials who are hanging out in China, so they keep tabs on them. They identify individuals who are discontent within the Chinese Communist Party, so if you say something negative about the party, they go after you. They gather information about dissidents in Hong Kong. They monitor CCP loyalists in Hong Kong to determine if they privately express any complaints about the CCP, and they also monitor WeChat for any sensitive vocabulary that would alert them. We often joke about social credit scores in China, and there's good reason to believe it's not as extravagant as we think it is, but China's intelligence agencies are repressive, no doubt. They currently appear to be aimed more at the countries near them and at themselves and against their own dissidents. There have been several notorious cases involving the MSS that have come to public attention. They reveal a lot about the priorities of the MSS and how they operate. You might not have heard about the 2010 to 2012 CIA agent purge inside China. It was one of the darkest times for the CIA, and it's considered one of the most significant blows to the US intelligence in recent history. During this period, the MSS managed to systematically dismantle the CIA's covert network in China. This resulted in them capturing or killing between 20 and 30 CIA informants. One of the US officials said in the report, quote, "You could tell the Chinese weren't guessing. The MSS were always pulling the right people," end quote. The exact methods and details of how they did this are still murky, but now that it's been more than 10 years that has passed, we have a better idea. There were likely multiple channels that the identities leaked through. One of them was probably Jerry Chung Xing Li, who was a former CIA officer, who was found with notes containing classified details of their operatives. Li was then arrested in 2018 and convicted of passing information to China. This betrayal might have contributed to the purge. It's also believed that a technical breach could have helped them identify the agents. China has a history of successfully breaching US Department of Defense databases and stealing intellectual property. This hack could have allowed them to see into CIA communication channels and allow them to monitor any communications between them and their informants. They used an internet-based system to communicate that they'd been using during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, so the CIA assumed that it couldn't be breached. This is according to a report from the Foreign Policy. The CIA had high-ranking officials on their payroll in Beijing. They were great for intelligence. These were people in China who had turned against what they saw as corruption and repression in the government. What likely happened next was a series of interrogations by the MSS. Once the CIA agents were captured, they were made to talk and inform on other identities. Peter Mattis and Matthew Brazil's book, Chinese Communist Espionage, became famous in part for a story that they recounted about how the MSS killed them. They claim in the book that it was a public killing of one of their own MSS officers in the courtyard of the agency's headquarters in Beijing so that all other agents could see. In fact, since he was a double agent for the CIA, they had all the other MSS agents forced to attend the execution in order to deter this from ever happening in the future. In fact, it's actually a lot worse than that, much more brutal in the version in the book, but I toned it down here because my last video got dinged by YouTube. What I can say is that it also involved members of the double agent's family. And so this story was very controversial, but I think once you put it into that historical context that we just talked about, of the history of how their intelligence agencies functioned and how they conducted purges, it was reported that some agents were shot in public as a warning to others about the risk of spying against China. It not only shut down the CIA network then, but it's also made it very difficult for them to rebuild it since then because of these executions. The MSS stepped up their foreign overseas operations after this. They've run the Operation Fox Hunt initiative since 2014. It's a global anti-corruption campaign. However, it's widely believed the MSS actually uses this mission as a cover to hunt down political dissidents abroad. They kidnapped anyone who criticizes the regime and attempts to escape China. For instance, the Causeway Bay books disappearances of 2015 illustrate this. Mainland Chinese law enforcement can't operate in Hong Kong without proper legal procedures and border controls, but 5 staff went missing and later appeared in China. One of them later appeared in a confessional video that China broadcast on their national television. These people insisted their return to China was voluntary, but their accounts failed to explain how they crossed international borders without proper documentation. MSS operatives crossed into Hong Kong and Thailand, abducted them, disregarded the sovereignty of these regions, and violated international law. They detained individuals who weren't terrorists or criminals because their only crime was publishing books about the private lives of Chinese leaders like Xi Jinping. This case demonstrates the lengths that the MSS will go to suppress dissent. Take, for example, Jack Ma, the billionaire Chinese founder of Alibaba. He disappeared from public view in 2020 after he made the mistake of publicly criticizing China's financial regulators and government. Then, authorities in China, the government halted the roughly $34 billion IPO of his company, Ant Group, which was going to be the world's largest IPO in history at the time. 3 months later, he resurfaced in a video saying that he was okay, and Jack Ma had learned his lesson. It doesn't matter how rich you are, the MSS will come for you if you gain enough influence in China. Chinese intelligence has reportedly been engaged in targeted killings of political dissidents and defectors, including the Uyghur activists abroad. Uyghur people are Muslims who China now controls their land in the western part of the country. One of the most notable cases, in 2012, there was a mysterious death of Li Wangjiang, who was a Chinese labor activist. Li was a key figure in the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, and he spent more than 20 years in prison. He was found hanged in a hospital, but the circumstances around his death were suspicious, and some believed that the Chinese security forces were involved in silencing him. Similarly, there have been numerous reports over the years of Uyghur activists and members of the Tibetan independence movement who've been harassed, abducted, or found dead under suspicious circumstances abroad. These cases often have connections to Chinese intelligence agencies, but they're difficult to confirm. Freedom House documented over 850 physical incidents of transnational repression globally by China, including assassinations, assaults, abductions, and detentions. One of the most brazen activities are in Taiwan, where the MSS is believed to send most of their resources and focus. Their goal is to undermine Taiwan's government, military, and society. The intelligence apparatus targets military officers, politicians, academic, and business leaders to gain sensitive information. In 2011, Taiwan's former military intelligence chief was convicted of spying for China, and it was one of the highest profile cases of Chinese infiltration. He passed on critical military information, including details on Taiwan's missile defense systems. According to a 2021 report, they've recruited thousands of Taiwanese individuals as spies, mainly through financial incentives. Just like how the CIA has a shadowy unit called the Political Action Group for influencing foreign politics, the MSS also has a political division. China's engaged in widespread political influence operations in Taiwan. China's United Front Work Department plays a crucial role in cultivating pro-China sentiment and creating division within Taiwan's society. They fund pro-China political candidates and attempt to influence public opinion through social media. Their domestic mission is the American NSA's wet dream come true. In July 2023, China's MSS opened up a WeChat account of their own as part of an effort to increase public engagement. I would also point out that the CIA also has an Instagram account that I follow and find it to be amazing. According to official news media, its first post called for a whole society mobilization against espionage. The post stated that the participation of the masses should be normalized. China's MSS is increasingly expanding its influence to nearly all aspects of Chinese society. The Communist Party is enlisting ordinary people to guard against perceived threats to the country, in a campaign that blurs the line between vigilance and paranoia. Despite facing its worst economic slowdown in years, China's authoritarian leader Xi Jinping appears more focused on national security and preventing threats to the party's control. In another post in September, the MSS criticized the United States' policies towards China, stating that the US was engaged in decoupling and disconnecting at the economic level, ganging up on the political level, deterrence and containment at the security level, discrediting and disparaging at the public opinion level, and constraining and locking down the rules level. I think the MSS is similar to the KGB. They have broad authority under the guise of national security to wield significant power and can take any action they see fit. But I want to know what you think in the comments section. Please leave a comment down below. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. I want to introduce you all to the newest member of the Spare Parts family. His name is Tucker, and he's a pug. And pugs are actually coincidentally from China. They're an old 400 BC they date back to in China. And he might be a Chinese asset. He might be from the MSS. Do they have you chipped? Are you an intelligence asset? Are you a little intelligence asset?